Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here with my 2026 First Stand Day number 1 overview and analysis video. We finally get to start our first big international tournament of 2026, and I'm super excited to get into it. Of course, we broke down everything you needed to know about this tournament, at least from my perspective, in the Primer and Power Rankings video that we put out a couple of days ago. In that video, not only did we power rank every single team at this tournament, but we power ranked every single player within their role as well. That seems to be a bit of a controversial video with the rankings that we got. We'll see how that ends up playing out. Unfortunately, as I said at the end of that video, we might not really get a chance to see a lot of the controversial takes, come to fruition or not come to fruition with the way that this format breaks down, but still very exciting to see these teams get to play some international competition at the beginning of the year. I'm super excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from the games that we got here today, and did they live up to your expectations? I'm super excited to get into this. I'm super excited that this tournament is taking place, in a Western time zone that's a little bit easier to watch here because I can get this video out relatively quickly, especially after these games are done. So very excited about that. But let me know what you thought of the games that we got, the 2 best of 5s that we got here today. I'll be talking about everything, but I don't want to waste too much time. I really want to get into the content because First Stand is, it's already been really fun, and I'm really excited to get into talking about some of these games. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game across both of these series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll look at the updated bracket, of course, with one of these groups kind of not determined, but certainly much more filled out after the first day here. We'll have our winners qualification series and then our, losers series to see who's going to be the first team eliminated from that first group, Group A in this particular case, and then, of course, tomorrow we flip over to the other side for the second group, but that will be saved for the end of the video, talking about what it means for the tournament as a whole. Most of today will be spent talking about the games we got on day number 1. So without further ado, let's get into things because I'm super excited, like I said, to begin talking about some of these games. And we kicked off this tournament with a fantastic matchup, arguably the closest matchup we have of the entire first round, first slate of games through the first couple of days. It was the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming, taking on the number 2 seed from the LCK in BNK FearX. And the reason this is such an exciting matchup, not only because it's LPL versus LCK, but because this is a big test, I think, for both of these teams. BLG really came on towards the end of the split, towards the end of the playoff run that they were on. They had a lot of struggles in the regular season at the start of split number 1, but kind of found their footing after some off-the-riff drama. Bin ends up getting into a big argument with some coaching staff, or some members of the coaching staff, I should say, and ends up walking out, leaving, and then coming back later on in the day. It's not really clear if Bin is going to get benched or suspended or anything like that. None of that ends up happening. Bin comes back. He starts playing like Giga Bin again, and all of a sudden this team kind of becomes unbeatable. They kind of steamroll their way through the playoffs, only going to 5 games against JDG in the upper bracket finals, and then kind of destroying them in the finals, really taking care of business everywhere else along the way, and more than deservedly getting the number 1 seed out of the LPL. The big question is, can they carry that good end of split form into First Stand? I predict that they can. I think a lot of the development that we saw from this team is more so expected rather than, shocking. This is a super team in terms of the talent that they have on their roster, and I think they finally have started to live up to that in terms of their actual playstyle. As I talked about in the primer, they are a very early game focused team. They are going to try and snowball games out of control with their great mechanical skill and their ability to win lane isolated in matchups. They almost always go into the mid game with a gold lead. Doesn't mean they always keep it. There have been a lot of games that they've, ended up throwing in terms of their inability to play the map well in the later part of the game. I think their objective setups are still quite bad, but one thing you have to say about the macro for BLG is that their snap engages and their decisiveness might be the best at this entire tournament. It's really helped them out throughout a lot of the LPL, and if they can continue to say, okay, you're out of position, we're not going to think about it, we're just going to go engage and try and trade for gold because we know we can do better if we start to snowball the game, then that is going to be massive. And the reason that that's massive into BNK FearX is they are also a very mechanical team in terms of the way they like to play the game. They very much rely on being able to generate some of these individual leads and get their main carries into spots where they can absolutely take over games. They've been able to do that relatively consistently throughout the LCK, and I am excited for FearX to be here, but I got a lot of criticism in my primer video because not only did I rank FearX 4th in terms of the teams at this tournament, but I ranked Raptor as the 6th best jungler. I put Vikla pretty low in my mid lane rankings. Clear was somebody that I wasn't super in on. I think this is a very bot lane focused team in terms of how they got here, and I'm really worried about that matchup in particular into BLG. Not that I think that Viper is, leaps and bounds better than Diablo, but I think this is one of the few bot lanes that should be more active on the map because Diablo and Kellen are much more focused on the 2v2, Viper and On much more focused on letting Viper play weak side and letting On roam and, be a lot more of a macro threat around the map. And then I think the solo lanes here are going to be what you have to focus on in a series like this. Vikla going into Knight, Clear going into Bim. These are both matchups that you would heavily favor BLG in. You have to be able to survive those because I think Raptor can jungle against Shun. Raptor, obviously somebody who I'm getting some pushback on for being low on, but the truth about Raptor is that he's just very flippy. He's very inconsistent, and you can look at a couple of games, you can look at the playoff run and say, oh, he was really good in the playoff run. That means he's figured it out, and that means he's flipped the switch. I think what we just saw is that the feast or famine part was just more feast in the playoffs, and that can definitely happen. Maybe he has taken that leap, but this is going to be a big test because he's going to have a lot of responsibility today, probably protecting a lot of these lanes because BLG is just better in the isolated matchups. If BFX can get some early leads, I think they're much better in terms of 5v5 teamfight execution towards the back end of these games. But if they can't get these early leads, BLG are just so good at strangle holding bad macro teams out of a lot of objectives. And while BFX are a good macro team, they're a good macro team when they have gold on Diablo. When they don't have gold on Diablo, they do kind of crumble in terms of where they want to put their resources in the late game. That's what we saw a lot in the finals or in the upper bracket finals as well against Gen G. And obviously it's Gen G, but like BLG is a very, very good team that is really good at strangling another team out. BFX are going to have to get Raptor into a good spot, and Diablo and Kellen are going to have to win on the bot side. If they can do that, I think they can actually win this series if everything goes right. Like I said, I think this is the closest matchup of any of the round one matchups. They're still coming in here as underdogs, in my opinion, but they have avenues to win. I think BLG need to capitalize on their mechanical advantage and specifically need to play through their solo lanes if they're going to be able to win this as cleanly as maybe they want to be. The only way to know how this series breaks down and the only way to kick off first stand is to go game by game. So I'm super excited. Let's get into it. Game number one. The winner of game number one was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number one. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this was a destruction. This was almost a 30-minute game, but boy, did it not feel like it in terms of watching it because this was over at 10 minutes. You get an ace at 15. You're up like 8,000 gold at 20. It's just a ridiculous stomp from BLG, and this is the version of this team we wanted to see show up to this tournament. Unfortunately for BFX, this is kind of the version of the team I more so expected to show up to this tournament in terms of how they played the early game, where their mechanics just aren't as good as some of the other teams at this tournament. Their ability to play the mid game is usually very strong. Getting Kellen to be able to move around with Raptor and make those aggressive plays, that can be good. If you don't get to the mid game, if you're going into 15 minutes down 2,000 gold, that's a really big problem for BFX. That's why I think this matchup can be a little bit difficult going into BLG, and boy, did we see that. The mechanical outplays and quite frankly, just the player diff that we saw on a couple of these lanes was absolutely massive. It looked like basically everybody on FearX was a bit nervous in this game number one. You have to hope they can weed that out. Because if they play like this, if this series kind of goes this way, it's going to be quite a boring start to first stand. Not that it's not exciting to see BLG dominate, but more so just like I was really hoping for a competitive game number one here. And BLG was not in the mood to give that to us because they absolutely wanted to stomp this first game of the tournament. Player of the game in game number one has obviously been, Giga Bin has carried his form over from the finals, clearly. This guy dominated Xiaoshu, and I think Clear is a weaker player than Xiaoshu in the top lane, especially in terms of 1v1 mechanics. And we definitely saw that Clear got kind of destroyed. That counter pick on the top side ended up really coming back to bite FearX in terms of how this breaks down. They banned the Renekton because they don't want any lane pressure, but leaving the Jax up with Bin on the other side is basically just giving him better Renekton because he's so good at this champion. It's obviously the champion that a lot of people think of when they think of Bin, and he dominated this top lane matchup. He froze the wave, he forced Clear to walk up, Raptor can't protect him from that, gets the kill with Shun, who's on the top side early on in the game, and from then on, resources are just getting bled out over and over again. By the end of the game, Bin was TPing into enemy lines, just going into 4 members, stunning as many people as he can, and 1v2ing Diablo and Kellen. Like, it was a ridiculously good performance from Bin, and I hate to say it, this should not be a surprise to anybody who watched the LPL playoffs. This guy has been in unbelievable form throughout the back end of the year. Everybody's talking about Keen being the best top laner in the world, and he is right now, but Bin, over the last couple of weeks in particular, like at the end of the playoffs, was playing around that level in terms of the way he was able to affect the game. And so don't be surprised if Bin continues to kind of abuse Clear on the top side. The only positive here for BFX is that he can't get Jax again. Knight also just destroys Vikla. He gets a solo kill at like 2 minutes because Vikla misplays around the Raptor pit. Really unfortunate there for Vikla, and it never gets easier. Knight ends up dominating on this Rise. It's a champion he's had a lot of success on over the course of this split. We talked about the solo lanes being the place to watch here for Bilibili Gaming, like being the part of the map that is so clearly better than BFX, and boy, did that come to fruition because both top and mid were just so out of control. Knight had like a 1,000 gold lead at 8 minutes just individually over a Talia, which is a nightmare scenario for that champion. And then obviously Bin ends up, with 11 kills in this game, dominating the backline, just being the most oppressive champion that you could possibly try to play into. It was a masterclass coming in from those two. I think On had a really good game, had a couple of moments where he was overextended, but as I said in the primer, people keep talking about On as if he hasn't been phenomenal across 2026. I think this might be the best start to a year he's had in a very long time in terms of maybe not consistency, because there are always going to be some On games, but his best games are happening a lot more frequently. He's not having a lot of those middle games. The bad games aren't as common, and the good games are significantly more common, which is really, really good to see. Again, he's going to have some moments where he's over-aggressed or where he's taking too much tower aggro and dying for basically no reason when he can, just flash out a little bit earlier and survive. But for the most part, all of the plays that he ended up going for were really advantageous for BLG, and he found a lot of great angles onto the backline. Shun was really good in this game, most of the time just baiting out FearX engages and kind of saying, hey, if you want to engage on me, then that's fine. That means you're not engaging on anyone else on the team, and that's very good. I think Viper was maybe a bit carried in this one. I'm not going to say he was bad, but this was very Viper in the finals, where he's just kind of a non-factor in this game as a whole. You wanted to see them win the spot lane 2v2 more, especially after Diablo blows flash in the early game. Just didn't really happen. BLG dominated everywhere else. Viper did not need to be the hero in this game on the Varus. I mean, the solo lane gap alone was absolutely massive, but the macro gap as well, and just the decisiveness, again, of being able to pull the trigger and capitalize when BFX are out of position. Really great stuff, and exactly what you wanted to see from BLG. And then for BFX on the other side, obviously they had their own set of problems here. Their solo laners got absolutely obliterated. Vikla is going to get dead of the game. He gets solo killed early on. He gets solo killed again later on under his tier 2 tower when tier 1 is still up, with Knight just playing super aggro on the rise. He looked useless in this game. He did 0 damage. And, one thing I haven't really mentioned yet is that I think BFX had the better draft in game number 1. Quite frankly, I'm coming out of this feeling more comfortable. I like the Vi Talia into like Kai'Sa and Bessa late game with the Nico to be able to set up a lot of backline, dive access on these relatively low mobility champions in the Varus and then the Rise if he's not able to stack up. Like, this is obviously something that can work out, but if you get destroyed in the early game, it becomes completely impossible to play the rest of this game out, and Vikla got destroyed. He's dead of the game for me, but it could very easily go to Clear on the top side as well. I'm not giving it to Clear, mostly because I think the way he lost was, while bad in the 1v1, not entirely his fault. It's just the way top lane goes when you're super far behind. Bin got completely out of control, and there was really nothing the Mbessa could do to try to bring anything back. I don't think Clear ended up making any horrible plays towards the end of the game. He just was constantly out of position. I think blowing the flash around, I want to say the 11-minute mark was probably his biggest mistake, but outside of that, it was mostly Bin just winning the 1v1 early and then Clear just being shut out of the game from there. Raptor ended up really running the game down towards the end. I thought, this game wasn't his fault. I really want to make that clear. I don't think Raptor was at fault for this game at all. The game was over by the time Raptor even got to play. Raptor will make some plays towards the end of games, especially that, when he's losing, that it's just like, man, he wants to go home. Like, this guy does not want to play a game number 2. Hopefully he can rebound his mental, because he looked very tilted at the end of this game going for some of the plays he was going for. Diablo and Kellen obviously weren't great. Diablo was out of position, cleansing nothing. He looked very nervous on stage on the player cams, and Kellen just never really got anything done on the Nico. BNK FearX looked very outclassed in game number 1. But it's game number 1. This is a best of 5. FearX can bounce back. This is a team that's been decently resilient, not only because they were bad last year, but they've even gone to some, pretty extensive lengths in the playoffs already to be able to kind of bounce back from some bad situations. I'm not counting them out, but this is exactly kind of what you wanted to see out of Bilibili in game number 1. And if they can do it again in game 2 and get that big 2-0 lead, it's going to look pretty dire for FearX. So can FearX even up the series at 1 apiece and keep themselves and keep their heads afloat, I should say, in terms of their mental, or is BLG going to dominantly start off their tournament with a bang? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FearX. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and they really, really needed this one. They needed to come out swinging. They needed to pick up this win, because going down 2-0 to BLG would have been a nightmare, but luckily they avoid that disaster, and they do more than avoid disaster. They end up coming out here and playing a pretty good game in game number 2. This was very close. Don't let the 26-minute game fool you. This was not a blowout by any stretch of the imagination. BNK was losing for a majority of this game, and then they end up finding their way back in because they have the only real scaling piece on the board throughout a lot of this endgame in the Jinx, and it ends up really working out for them. We're going to talk a bit about draft here, but I think really what this comes down to is just better execution coming in from BFX in the endgame, and this is something I also want to talk about because this plays into some of the narratives that we really established for these two teams going into this. BLG are a better team at generating leads, and it's not particularly close. They are incredibly mechanically talented, and even in this game, it kind of felt like it was just going to be over with how massive the mid lane gap was, but but BFX are better 5v5 team fighters. They just are. That is their bread and butter. That's where they are going to win games at this tournament. And if you let them get to the part of the game where they can take, 5v5s and be more consistent, BLG, that is their biggest weakness, is that they're constantly in bad positions to take these team fights at the end of games, mostly because their AD carry has kind of been a letdown over the course of 2026, but also because it really doesn't feel like their setups are all that consistent. BFX punish that incredibly hard and end up picking up a series-tying win in game number 2 to push us to what is a very fun game number 3 now. So let's talk about it. We'll start with draft, as we almost always do here. Ironically enough, I do kind of favor the BLG draft at least a little bit. I really don't like the Jinx pick in isolation, and that's kind of what I want to make the preface of this. I like the BLG draft in isolation. Like, if you were to take nameplates off, I think I would like the BLG draft more, just in terms of, how many more options you have. The Pantheon Aurora should have, like, Perma Prio in the early game. Aurora is really good into Annie, and I think Ezreal Nami should just decimate this Jinx Karma lane. It completely wastes Karma on F1, in my opinion, to pick it with Jinx. I really don't think there's any reason to ever go for this bot lane. But with nameplates on, it becomes a lot more explainable, because what BFX actually did is really just play to their own team's strengths. They get Diablo on a hyper carry regardless of, whether or not you have consistent setup to be able to play with it. And then you get Raptor on something that can be aggressive, that can dive into the late game and really kind of, put pressure on the enemy team. He's always going to be at his best when he can start to pressure out members of the enemy team who are a little bit weaker or a little bit more frail. Even if that does mean that he's going to be a bit more susceptible, he's always going to be more comfortable on champions like this. You have Vikla on something that, even if it goes down, let's say, I don't know, a hypothetical number like 3,000 gold in this game, it can still be useful. And then Clear on something that's just kind of good generally on the top side. Like, this fits their identity. Kellen is obviously a massive Karma player. It's his #1 champion. So you really like the identity for BFX, even if I don't like the draft in isolation, mostly because I think Jinx should just not be able to play this game. Like, it should be nearly impossible for Jinx to execute on this, but as we saw, that was not the case. Diablo's going to get player of the game. He gets the first pentakill of first stand. I want to give him all the credit in the world for the pentakill. I really do, but boy, was this game not really Diablo's. Like, I really do think that he deserves player of the game because he was the most important piece on the board. The Jinx was the most important champion. It's what won them the game, but BLG end up taking the worst possible fight to end this game. Like, Knight and Bin are on the complete opposite side of everything going on. Your Scion and your super fed Aurora are just nowhere near the fight, and your entire team is trying to take this. It's a miserably bad fight call from BLG, as they've made a lot of over the course of this year, and Diablo ends up capitalizing by picking up the pentakill. Right before that, obviously, he ends up burning Flash and dying in a spot that gives over Baron for free to BLG. That should have been the end of the game. Like, it really should have been BLG from then on out, but luckily, Diablo's mistakes are never punished. That's just kind of the way things go for BLG in particular, and Diablo, quite frankly, gets away with a ton domestically as well, and I'm glad that international fans are starting to see kind of the real truth of who Diablo is. One of the most mechanically talented team fighters you will ever see, a fantastic laner, and somebody who will randomly die in the middle of the game for no reason because he's greedy backing. Just the way things go with him, but again, you got to give him credit for being that piece on the board that ends up being the scaler. This Jinx should be irrelevant in this game. Again, you look at the comp for BLG, it's almost impossible for Jinx to be able to pilot this game really easily, and for most of this game, that was true. The Aurora was really strong. The Flash from Pantheon was always going to be a threat coming in onto the backline. And you don't really have consistent peel anywhere. Like, you kind of need Annie and Karma to do other things throughout a lot of this game, but Diablo's still able to get off one good team fight, and that's all he really needs. He really got 2 good team fights off. He was really good in the team fight they won before that as well. So overall, good game from Diablo. Want to see him not make his massive mistakes, but that's, it's Diablo, right? Like, I'm going to continue to praise the guy because the good definitely outweighs the bad. I think Raptor and Kellen were the other 2 players that you want to give a lot of credit to. Kellen had a very sneaky, phenomenal game on this Karma. Once again, his best champion, in my opinion. I think a lot of people would, put that there. Maybe the Lulu as well, kind of up there, but this was a really, really good game from him, being able to put a lot of pressure onto the backline of BLG while also making sure that he can keep a lot of pressure away from the Jinx. Obviously, the most important part of this game is that Diablo gets to auto attack, and I think Kellen did that towards the end, but he was doing a lot of damage in the mid game as well that really turned a lot of these fights. Raptor was playing really, really well in this game. I thought he played great on the Neferi, balancing a lot of aggro well. I think his early game was weak, but that's kind of what you expect from this champion. Overall, I think he ended up piloting it, fine. Clear at a much better game. Vikla got destroyed. I mean, this was a mid-gap of the century, and if I'm Knight, I'm so tilted getting 3,000 gold up and like 2 full levels up on Annie in the laning phase and still losing this game. I'd be so upset, but Vikla's, typing in chat mid-diff, whatever, you know what I mean? Who cares? I'm playing Annie, and I almost tweeted this out during the game. Small plug, go follow me on Twitter. Links are in the description, but I almost tweeted this out during the game where it's like, LCK Annie, no problem, bro. I'm down 3,000 gold. I'm still just going to ult somebody and be fine. It does not matter. It's just the way things go with that champion. So credit to BFX. I think they played really well here in game number 2. Maybe, you know, they needed some luck to win this, but they got the luck. BLG made a ton of mistakes down the stretch, and that's really emblematic of BLG. That's not something that I think is just going to go away, and it kind of shows the identity of who this team is going to be. They need to get leads early game. They really do need to be in a spot where they can snowball games out of control because they're not consistent at being able to play these 5v5s, and when you get put in this position where you kind of have to play for neutral, it just falls apart. And I think the big reason for that, again, for me, is that Viper has just not been good enough. This guy was irrelevant in this game on the Ezreal. He's out of the game for me. I think you could give this to On as well. I think he had a lot of positioning mistakes. There were moments where he used the ultimate at the wrong time. I don't think this was a very good Nami game from him at all, and I definitely feel like it's worthwhile to, you know, kind of give him dead of the game if you really want to, but I honestly just have a gripe against Viper, who's constantly in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's missing cues in team fights. He's, you know, not in fights that really matter, like the bottom side of the map engage that ends up breaking down for BFX and kind of going in their favor to get them back in terms of gold in this game. Like, Viper is just constantly in the wrong place at the wrong time. He arcane shifts forward in the middle of laning phase to give Diablo a double kill early as well. Like, a ton of huge mistakes coming in from this Ezreal, and Viper has been the weak link for BLG all year long, and that's starting to become a really big problem. It really does feel like the big gap in this series, or at least the big gap in favor of FearX in this series, is the AD carry position, where I ranked Diablo 2 and I ranked Viper 3. That's looking like it's coming true. Diablo is having a much bigger impact on this series as a whole right now than Viper is, and that is the part of the map that FearX need to continue to invest in if they want to take this series against BLG. They have a lot of tools to fight back. Knight is omega tilted here. He destroyed the mid lane matchup, and Knight is playing out of his mind right now. He can still 1v9 carry this series. He just can't really do it on champions like Aurora. I would love to see something that's going to be a bit more universal picked for him in the mid lane. I also think Shun is having a very good series as well. We didn't get to see a ton of it towards the end here, but he's playing the map well, and he still is that decisive version of himself. If you can get Bin back on a carry, especially a matchup that he can dominate on the 1v1 on the top side, like, I love Sion, and I think it's good here, but Bin just had a Giga Bin moment on Jax, and you put him on a tank in game number 2, that's got to be a bit frustrating. If you just get back to basics for BLG, I still think you can be favored in this series, but BFX keep themselves alive and, quite frankly, take a lot of momentum in this game number 2. Diablo has woken up. I think the nerves are still there, but they're starting to go away, and Raptor, I think, is playing well today. So there are a lot of tools for FearX to be able to take this game 3, which has suddenly become one of the most important games of the entire tournament, considering this is one of the few round 1 matchups that I think could actually go either way. So massive game 3 here. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FearX. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and somehow, someway, against all odds across these games so far, BFX has been able to walk out of this with a 2-1 series lead. It's unreal. There's really no reason that they should be in this series in terms of these, you know, drafts and how these games are going. They're in spots where all they need to do is just, like, execute in the mid game. They're not really all that good in terms of mid game execution, but their team fights have been so much better that even though you're staring down a Zeri who's 3,000 gold up, and all you have to try and deal with it is a Nocturne that's trying to get onto the backline and should wholly be unsuccessful in this game. BLG are so bad at being able to execute in the late game that it still ends up being free. This is an unreal game number 3, the most entertaining game of the tournament for sure up until this point. It's only the first series, but I can't imagine there's going to be a lot more games that are more entertaining than this one. I have a massive rant to go on because, honestly, I'm serious. I think one player is actively sabotaging BLG. You know, I think you know who I'm talking about. Viper is, like, single-handedly losing them this series. He has chosen to lose these games, and if he doesn't turn around, it's cooked. Like, Diablo didn't even play all that well in this game. I thought he made a ton of mistakes, had some really bad mental errors on the Ashe, really kind of threw away a lot of momentum that BFX had, but Viper is solo losing them the game. Like, they put every resource into letting this Zeri carry, because of course you do. Look at the comp that you've built around this Zeri. You have to let her carry in the late game, and Viper refuses to win. He refuses to stay alive. It is the worst series I've seen him play, and I'm starting to get a little bit nervous for BLG because they can't win without him if they're going to draft like this, and that kind of segues nicely into the draft. I think BLG win this draft, right? Again, I think nameplate's off. You're looking at a situation where they obviously outscale. There is no universe in which they do not win in late game team fights, not only because of the Zeri, but all of this talk about the Cassante being unkillable. If you just play these fights slow enough, the Cassante is a sitting duck. Yes, he's tanky, but you don't really have any ways to enable anybody else with Cassante standing on the front line. He's just there to take damage, and while you can knock the Zeri back over the wall, as, you know, the commentators were talking about throughout a lot of this game, It's like a completely useless assertion that K'Sante should ever be able to be on the Zeri in the first place. Now, obviously, it ends up working out that way because Viper is playing as if he is the K'Sante throughout a majority of this game on the Zeri and actively losing the game for his team because of it. But like, this should be a game where you just play so slow, you drop the equalizer, you just start poking out with Zeri, you use the Yuumi ultimate, you combo that with Wukong going on to the Mel and only the Mel, and the fight is over. There's nothing to do. There's no way to outplay that for BFX, but somehow, some way, BLG have no clue how to execute on a comp that they themselves drafted. BFX have much better execution, and really what it comes down to is that the Mel, the one piece on the enemy team that actually can do some damage in the late game, got completely untouched in most of these team fights. Vikla is player of the game. He was the most valuable player on the map, and it was not particularly close. Vikla gets solo killed again pre 1 minute into this game, and it feels like it's going to be an absolute nightmare. Not solo killed, but first blooded. That's what I meant to say. And it feels like it's going to be a nightmare again for BFX, but he rallies. He wins lane against Knight's Ahri. It's a good matchup for Mel, and she should be in a relatively good spot. And then his mid and late game team fights are nearly perfection. So many resources have to go into shutting him down because they ignore him for way too long. Maybe it was player diff. Maybe they were just like, oh, we don't need to worry about Vikla. Let's go for Diablo. But you're staring down a Mel and an Ashe, and you're choosing to kill the Ashe over the Mel. It just feels really confusing to me. It feels like BLG just misplay, and Vikla is the beneficiary. He obviously ended up executing on these fights incredibly well, but for some reason, this guy was completely uncontested in the back end of the game, and that's insane for BFX. They got really lucky with that, and Vikla very much punished BLG for making that big mistake. I do want to give him credit because the mental in this series felt like it was utterly destroyed for Vikla, and he rallied in this game. Again, he carried, in my opinion. People are going to give a lot of credit to Clear because he was pretty unkillable towards the end of this game, but Clear made a lot of mistakes in terms of his positioning and in terms of the fights that he wanted to try and initiate and go for. He really did not play this game slow and consistent. He just was on a champion that was in a really good spot in this game. Obviously, that accounts for a lot, but I think Clear, again, made a lot of errors and mistakes. Raptor got caught multiple times in this game in situations he had no business being far forward. He was wasting his ultimates. He was dying on the Wukong because he couldn't burst down that champion. It was the one champ you don't really want to dive on. And then Diablo and Kellen obviously had their moments. Kellen had a great game. I don't think he's getting nearly enough credit. This Seraphine was ginormous throughout this game. Easily the second best player on the team from my perspective. Diablo was overall, I think, fine. He did a lot of damage in team fights, but again, I mean, all 4 of those deaths were entirely preventable from him. He made a ton of mental errors, and that's just what BFX are. They're a team that's going to put their pedal to the metal, and sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes it's not. The lucky thing for them is BLG is like screwing up all over the map right now. Their mental is horrible. This is one of the worst macro series I've seen out of a major region team in a long time from BLG, and BFX love that environment. They love that the enemy team is making mistakes because they're really good at capitalizing on them with their decisiveness, and so credit to BFX. It might not be clean, but it certainly is effective right now. And then for BLG on the other side, I'm sorry, dude. Viper is not it right now. I tweeted out during this series, like, can we get Elk back, please? Viper has played bad, I would say, or below average for a majority of this year. You know, I've talked about it a lot on the LPL cast and on the LPL weekly recaps that I do on this channel. Viper is obviously a player who has not lived up to expectations. He was nowhere near the best AD carry in the LPL. He looked like a downgrade from Elk, who was the best AD carry in the LPL on Weibo Gaming throughout a lot of this year, but it's like a new level right now. Viper is getting destroyed out there. This guy was up 3,000 gold in no part due to himself. Like, he was just collecting side waves and, you know, getting gold over and over again because the Zeri could free farm throughout a lot of this matchup. This is a great matchup for Zeri Yuumi. The casters kind of touched upon this, but this is a counter pick for a lot more reasons than just the level 6 all-in, mostly because Zeri just gets free farm throughout a majority of the game without any real threat of pressure because the Yuumi can dissuade a lot of the engage attempts, and Zeri is basically inevitable on the current patch. But somehow, some way, Viper found a way to constantly be killed first in every team fight. Jumping over walls, out of position, pushing mid-wave without any help from the rest of his team. I mean, this is genuinely one of the worst Zeri games you will ever see. Do not let the KDA fool you. Don't let the damage charts fool you. His positioning was -10. Like, dud of the game, like, I don't really know what else to say. Like, it really was that bad. I can't even begin to describe how frustrated I got watching this game, because this should have been, if Viper played like a human being, this game is not close. It really is just that diff. Like, Knight didn't have a great game on the Ahri. I'm definitely willing to say that. This was his weakest game of the series. Bin really wasn't able to do a ton on the top side on this first pick. Rumble, this K'Sante was a great counter pick, and they did a great job taking him away in the early game. That's the BFX game plan that I really enjoyed, and I think that Shun, while he had a couple of nice engages, really didn't find anything great towards the end of the game, mostly because he was on peel duty for for this Zeri. But at the end of the day, you're a Zeri, you're 3,000 gold up, and you're going into Mel, and somehow you lose that. And to me, that's just completely unacceptable. Like, this is one of those games that Viper is going to have to look back on. If they lose this series, like, all of the blame kind of has to go to Viper for not winning this game number 3. And I get it, like, you can blame the team, but I'm serious. Like, positioning-wise, this might be a bottom 1 game that I've watched in 2026. It really was that bad. He has to be better moving into game number 4 because it's do or die. If BFX win this, they move on to that qualification series. It's obviously not an elimination for either of these two teams, but what a massive upset that would be at the start of round number 1 if BFX are able to pick up the win here and move on. And what a statement from the LCK that would be, that they are by far and away the best region in the world. Are BFX going to be able to close this out in game 4, or will BLG keep themselves alive and push us to a Silver Scrapes to kick off first stand? Well, the winner of game number 4 was BLG. Bilibili Gaming pick up game number 4. They're going to keep this series alive, and in our first series of First Stand, we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. How can you not be excited for that? I mean, it's best case scenario here that we're getting such close action on day number 1 in the series that I think we all wanted to see be competitive and be close. This is a tournament that I think kind of encourages less interesting matchups, to be quite frank, because of the two groups. A lot of the teams that are around each other's skill levels are in different groups right now on other sides, but this is one of the few matchups where I really did think things could be really interesting, and boy, have they become interesting. BLG dominate themselves once again to a game 4 win. Both of their wins in this series have been dominant, and quite frankly, they should have won game number 3. Game number 2 was kind of also in their hands. They misplayed a couple fights more obviously in that one. I think that BFX had a lot more tools in game number 2 to be able to pick up that victory, but really, BLG should not be losing this series in the position that they are in. That doesn't matter, though, because we're still in this one. It doesn't matter that you've played better. You got to be able to keep this momentum up. We'll talk about what they did right in this game and what they did wrong, and what I think that could mean for a game 5 draft that really matters for where this series is going to go. First off, obviously, with the draft, again, nameplates off, I think I would favor BFX, but nameplates on, I definitely favor BLG in terms of comfort on this composition. Not only do you draft the Renata very early on because you want an Enchanter to pair with the Yunara, because you have to take that away from Yunara. Lulu on the other side, although, let me tell you, you definitely don't have to take that away from Viper. He will int on that champion. We know that very well, not only from this series, but from the finals in the LPL as well. But they do want to take it away. They get Diablo hyper carry, and they want to play an Enchanter with it, so they pick Renata. But then BLG go for the least committal comp you could possibly go for. And quite frankly, this LeBlanc is massive in terms of this draft. I think this Yorick is also very good. And really, the identity here for BLG is just saying that we know we're not better than you in a 5v5 team fight. And they're not, right? Like, they're just not a better team at being able to execute in the later part of the game. We've not only seen that in this series, but that was the scouting report on both of these teams coming into this tournament, is that that's BFX's strength, that's BLG's weakness. You don't really want to get to that part of the game. So draft this perma side lane, like, super pick oriented comp that has something like a Maokai that can, you know, force an engage if you need to and if you're ahead, but doesn't have a lot of committal engage if you're behind. You have Lulu as well to kind of accelerate the pace of the game if you need to. I really like this draft for BLG with the identity of how this series has progressed, because I think it puts them in a position where they can kind of choose where and when they want to fight, which is obviously really massive. BFX on the other side, I think they also have a good team fight comp. Like, there are a lot of ways for them to be able to win 5v5, which is their strength in the later part of the game. But again, you're looking at a couple of matchups that I don't think are particularly favorable, and you're going into Lulu, which is probably the strongest champion in the game right now from my perspective. Maybe Orianna. Orianna's the strongest champ in the game, but Lulu is number 2 for me on that list, and you don't really have a clean answer to be able to get through a lot of those Lulu shields and the free health that you're going to be giving champions like Sivir and Maokai in a lot of these exchanges. Shun, for me, is going to get player of the game on the Maokai. Some people were confused after, I think, the Maokai pick on F5 here, because you're going into Trundle. Why would you want to pick tank? He ends up building full AP, which I also don't necessarily agree with, but boy, were his decisions on the Rift basically perfect. He had a nearly flawless game on the Maokai in terms of being able to affect the map. Not only does he pick up that first blood onto Vikla by capitalizing on him overextending in the mid lane, but he takes that pressure, transitions it into topside, and is able to get a gank off to set clear behind as well, and really kind of destroy his game on the Gnar after a really good early gank from Raptor to really put Bin into a bad spot. So Shun kind of salvaging multiple lanes there and then being a menace in the later part of the game. He was not scared to pull the trigger on some ultimates, and even when he didn't have the ult up on the Maokai, he was still very willing to dive in with the W and try and affect the game by being that main centralizing front force, and he scared off BFX in a lot of instances. They really had no answer for this Maokai, so credit to Shun. I thought he was easily the best player in this game. On was very close for me, but so much of that is just Lulu being broken as a champion. I don't really understand why other, like, top teams don't understand that Lulu is not broken, that it just kind of of wins you games with consistency because it's good in lane at being able to poke out and keep your AD carry alive. It can win the 2v2, but it doesn't even really have to, because once you start moving Lulu around the map, all of a sudden your mid jungle becomes a lot stronger, your team fight becomes a lot stronger because you have all that extra health, and the polymorph is just broken going into a hyper carry. If Lulu flashes in and just polymorphs the Yunara, the fight is over. BFX can't really play this out. So on, playing it really well, I thought he had a great game, but really I think a lot of that is the champion and less so on, making unbelievable plays. Viper didn't run it down. He actually had a really solid game from a positioning perspective. I actually think he played really well. There was one fight around the Rift Herald where I thought he played asymmetrical to maybe how I would have played it, or how I think, the team wanted him to play it, quite frankly, with Shun kind of going in on a different part and then Viper kind of being on his own, protected by the Lulu. I would love to see some sort of synergy come back between these two. Jungle AD carry, I felt like they're on opposite ends of the entire mental spectrum throughout this entire series in terms of, what kind of plays they want to make. And if they can't get synced up, then I think things are going to be a bit of a problem. But with the amount of damage that was going on in this game, Viper kind of locked it in towards the end and everything was fine. Bin was really good in the side lane. Knight was doing so much damage on this LeBlanc. This was a good game for BLG. Really not a lot to complain about. And then for BFX on the other side, I mean, the Diablo win condition can really easily be shut off by this Lulu. And now you're kind of putting a lot of pressure elsewhere on the map. The moment you start losing in this jungle mid and Raptor can't really get the ball rolling in the early game, I do think things become a lot more difficult, because while you do scale, you don't really have a lot of tools to be able to shut down BLG kind of controlling the map and playing the side lanes effectively, because your wave clear really isn't all that good. Again, clear kind of getting behind on the top side really affects that negatively. But for me, Kellen is dud of the game. Multiple Renata ultimates just going wide, like not hitting the right targets, not being positioned in the right way. It wasn't just the one on the top side jungle fight that, Azael ended up calling out. There were multiple on the bot side as well, where he was trying to hit the Lulu before she could cast polymorph, but that ability is way too slow, and you're not really going to be able to target that well. If you're only hitting the Lulu with Renata ultimate, you're probably wasting the Renata ultimate. So Kellen with a pretty poor game on a champion a lot of people really like him on. The solo laners also kind of got back to business in this one with what we expected. Vikla and Clear very much felt like they were very far behind. Clear with some really questionable plays. Vikla unfortunately just had a bad scoreline because of the game state. I think Raptor played, pretty poor in this one as well. Diablo had a couple of moments where it felt like he could try to take over, but again, Yunara into Lulu, nightmare scenario. This is not really what you want to be playing for. So BFX now on the back foot for the first time since the end of game number 1 as we head into a Silver Scrapes game 5. I'm so excited. Both of these teams have kind of proven what they are in this series. BLG is very good at generating leads. They've had a gold lead in all 4 games in this series, and they've only been able to close out 2 of them because they're bad at team fighting. And BFX, on the other hand, they're not exactly the most talented team in the world. Their laning has actually been super subpar, and I think they are making mistakes, but at the end of the day, they're better at 5v5s. If they can stall the game out to the point where they are neutral going into the late game, you have to consider them favorites in a game 5 where teams might be a bit more passive. So either of these teams have a very good chance to win. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will move on to what is essentially the upper bracket finals of their group, the qualification series of their group, whereas BFX now, with this loss in game 5, moves down to the lower bracket. They'll have to win 2 subsequent series after this, after having used, obviously, their extra life in this series to move on to that next round, to the semifinals of this tournament. It's still very doable for BFX, especially with some of the ways that they played here today. I think that there are some positives. I think that there are some negatives to take away from this series, but BLG, I think, were, at least in my opinion, I don't know how controversial this will be, pretty clearly the better team by a pretty large margin here today. I think they should have won this series in 4 games. I think game 3 was a monumental throw. Even game 2, I think, was pretty winnable from BLG. I'm not going to sit here and say that BFX was like terrible or that they should have lost every game. I don't really like this like 5-0 or 4-1 argument that ends up coming out of a lot of series like this. I feel like it takes away from the fact that closing a game is a skill. Like, it does matter that you can win, but at the end of the day, I think BLG kind of showcased that they were just better at being able to get leads and really be able to, kind of be better mechanically than BFX throughout a lot of this series, and if they can limit their mistakes, this is a team that can be very dangerous. But that is a very important caveat that they were not always good at in this series, just pretty good at throughout a lot of the end games here. Again, for BFX, there are a lot of things I'd like to see cleaned up. I think their early games were quite bad throughout this entire series. I honestly don't even think their mid games were very good either. The thing that ended up saving them in a couple of these games is that their team fighting is really good, and that's where they thrive as a team. But, I think a lot of the problems I had with BFX kind of came to fruition here. I'm not going to sit here and say that I was right, because people are going to get really mad if I say that, because they hated the ranking in the first place, and this team just took BLG to 5. How can you possibly say that BFX is the 4th best team? Like, I get it. You can kind of take away what you want here for BFX. As I said in the video, they're in the same tier as JDG. If you wanted them 3rd, they're 3rd. If you wanted them 4th, they're 4th. It doesn't really matter to me. They have basically identical grades as teams. I ended up siding with JDG because of the play style, but BFX was fine here today. They made the same mistakes that I expected them to make, and they made the same good plays that I expected them to make. So, it just kind of ends up being, I don't want to say a wash, but I mean, BFX is who we thought they were. I think that's how the series ended up turning out. For BLG, though, on the winning side, player of the game for me in Game 5 is going to go to Viper. Finally, Viper had a good game in this series. I will say Game 4 and Game 5 were both very solid from Viper. He was super consistent on the Sivir in Game 4, not really getting himself into bad positions, and, kiting, I think, relatively well on that champion to be able to output maximum damage against the front line. And then this Caitlyn was massive throughout the end of this game. I kind of have a controversial take, at least from what Azael was talking like on the broadcast. I think this comp is very feast or famine from BLG. I certainly don't think this is like a free win, in the same way that I think the Jinx comp was not a free win for BFX in game number 2 either. I really don't think that that was like an Omega pick, like, oh my god, you dominate this game kind of thing. This is the stereotypical feast or famine draft. Like, you either have a 2k gold lead at 10 minutes or it becomes a lot more difficult to win this game because you are going to be lacking in damage. This Camille is eventually going to do basically nothing throughout the later part of this game. If you're not able to scale out of control and you've got Jace Caitlyn, like, you really have no backup plan if you end up going neutral in the early game. Add that onto the fact that you're already a team that's shown itself to be weaker in 5v5s, and you're staring down a champion in Zoe on the other side that I think is really strong here, a champion in Kennen that I think is relatively strong here, at least in terms of the comp. I don't like Kennen in general. I think that champion's very low damage right now, but like, you have ways to win this game for BFX that are a little bit more straightforward. I think Jhin is going to be a bit more consistent than Caitlyn in the mid game, where you kind of need to generate those leads. Like, this is a game where BLG needed to be active and aggressive and play away from the Caitlyn, and I'm really glad that they kind of identified that. If this team had just said, well, we have Caitlyn, we kind of have to play for the bot lane 2v2, kept on more stationary, tried to play against the Jhin, I think things would have gone a bit more problematic for them. I think it would have been more difficult for them to win this game had they, not identified that, let's just move on to the top side. Shun can be, 4 camps down. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to gank over and over again and get massive leads through these fights. And they absolutely did that. Viper's player of the game, but for me, player of the series as a whole is absolutely Shun in the jungle. I didn't really consider anybody else for this. I think this is like the most obvious I can give out, the most obvious award I can give out. I think he was by far the best player on the Rift here today. Shun had a fantastic series. And Raptor, while I think he did well in the mid game, like, this was actually a pretty good mid to late game, not only Lee Sin performance, but, generally I think a lot of these games went the same way for Raptor, which was bad early game and then, pretty good mid to late game. Shun's early games were so much better than BFX's and then Raptor's on the other side. I think that was a massive difference in being able to consistently get BLG these gold leads, which obviously in their wins, they just snowballed out of control. That is Shun. That is the style he likes to play. And quite frankly, I thought he was excellent in this series. The moment he started picking up the tanks at the end, I think he accelerated to a new level, but he was great in game number 1 as well. I generally just think Shun was by far the best player on the Rift here for BLG. Just kind of got hidden by how good Bin was in game number 1. Knight was a consideration. I think Bin was a consideration because of that game 1 on the Jax for me, but at the end of the day, Shun was, better, and I think it ended up, working out at the end. Viper finally had a couple of good games. Shun ends up looking really good. The 2 new additions to BLG and the players that I think had the most question marks coming into this tournament, I think, really paying it out. Bin, Knight, and On, I think, still doing their thing. On is a psychopath for picking Camille support in game number 5. What a ridiculous thing to do, and obviously it ends up working out, but man, if this didn't work out, that would have been a crazy talking point, but at the end of the day, we have a very clear idea of who BLG is. They are exactly who we thought they were, in the same way that BFX are exactly who we thought they were. They're a team that needs to generate leads early. They have to snowball games out of control because they're not clinical. In the later part of the game, their vision control is quite lacking, and they're going to lose even team fights because somebody is going to get caught because they're just so greedy and over-aggressive. But if they can snowball games out of control and get those big early game leads because of their mechanical skill, they're a very difficult team to deal with because they're so good, and they're often up in gold basically every single game. So credit to BLG for moving on, and for BFX, again, I don't know if I'm a Debbie Downer or if I'm just, like, if people are okay with this, but, like, this is exactly who we thought they were, and this is, like, exactly what, like, the 4th or 3rd best team at this tournament looks like. They made a lot of mistakes here today. I don't think this is one of those series where, BFX took them to 5, and that's great, but I think that this really should not have gone that far with how BFX played. They got bailed out in a couple of big situations in games 2 and 3. And they need to play better than this. I think they can play better than this. I'm not sitting here saying that I think they're terrible, but this is not proof to me that BFX are like a team that can compete to go to the finals here. I think they still can. I think they've always been a team that needs to show up on any given day or anything like that. But this was a team that kind of got away with a lot here today. And then when they couldn't get away with it, they just started losing. I will say their mid games, even when they were losing, were pretty solid. There was always like once per game where BLG would make a mistake and BFX would capitalize on it. That is the positive thing to take away from this series for me for BFX, is that they were really good at capitalizing on mistakes that BLG were making. They just weren't really all that good at being able to generate any leads. Like, they were super outclassed individually in a lot of their lanes, and that is a problem. Diablo and Kellen were solid in the 2v2, definitely better on that phase, but Viper started playing more consistent and playing a lot less aggressive towards the end of the series, and then Diablo and Kellen had no leads to generate. I know people are going to criticize the Jhin. I think if you play anything more aggressive here, it's impossible. Like, any hyper carry in this spot, this game is over. There's no way for you to be able to play that out, and obviously you don't really want him on something like Misfortune. Instead, it's just kind of locking Diablo into a corner where it's like, we know you want to play a hyper carry, but not only have you played a lot of them through 4 games, but also if you pick one here, it's a bad spot. It's the draft strategy a lot of teams employed against FearX at the end of last year, where it's basically forcing Diablo to play something that can contest in lane, and him not really being as adept at doing that. And then his support kind of let him down here today. Kellen was really bad in both Game 4 and Game 5. Now, Game 5, it's not necessarily his fault. The Rakan is pretty hard countered by the Camille. On the other side, even things like the Poppy, obviously, and the Morgana really shut down with what Rakan wants to do. The Caitlyn traps can really make it difficult for Rakan to go in. This is a very bad Rakan game, and I hate this pick in general, but really the big negative here is the champion pool for Kellen, which I think is kind of shown to be a little bit more limited than it is going to be for a lot of other supports at this tournament. When the enchanters are off the board, he has some very specific engagers that he wants to go to. Outside of that, he is going to be susceptible, and we saw that. There's no reason to pick Rakan in this draft. I think if you have a different support in this spot, multiple other options. By the way, Leona was left up on the board. I think that's a little bit more playable just because you're a little bit tankier, but more specifically, like if you have something that can just play a little bit more in the mid ground on the board here, then, Kellen, I think, can potentially have a better game, but because you go for the Rakan, who's this dash around champion, all or nothing kind of pick, it ends up really hurting BFX's comp. I think that's the only part of this draft that I really hate for BFX in terms of how it's structured. Lee Sin, I think it is what it is. Raptor was, really set behind in the early game, and that makes Lee Sin kind of hard to pilot. He was able to pull back quite a bit of gold in the mid game, but that really never mattered. Like, Lee Sin losing in the early game means that even if he does eventually get fed, it's not like he's going to do anything with it. In the end game, that's the part of the game where he's supposed to be getting leads for his laners, and it just didn't really happen. Vikla was supposed to be strong in this game, and he was doing a lot of damage, but boy, he was getting chunked by Caitlyn. Clear, I think, never really found that angle onto the backline. Diablo can't really do anything on Jhin. This is just one of those games where the moment that you get out-tempoed and out-macroed in the early game, it's kind of over. Again, that's what the feast or famine style of BLG's draft means, is that if BLG end up feasting, there's no way to play against it. It's just, you kind of have to hope that BLG end up making mistakes, which they didn't really do in game number 5. For BFX, again, I think that there's a way for them to be more competitive moving forward and to be more consistent. Diablo has shown the mechanical upside, but again, the mental errors, the decision-making errors that I think this team made in this series were staggering. And even though Vikla and Clear kind of locked it in, I would say down the stretch here and played a little bit better in the 1v1s, I still think that they look like liabilities at the top-end level. Kellen did not look like he is somebody that can go deep into a series against top-tier teams. Raptor was the best player on the Rift here today, and he still had some really bad early games. And so BFX, to me, has a lot of things they need to fix moving into the lower bracket, but they'll likely have time to get those fixed with the teams that they're likely going to run into. And then for BLG on the other side, this is obviously a really nice win, but they're not out of the woods just yet either. Like, they needed to clean up a lot of things in this series. This is likely the most difficult matchup they will have in the group, which means that they should be getting out as the number 1 seed, depending on, I guess, how ridiculously good G2 or whoever comes out of this next series ends up looking. But Viper has to be better than whatever he was through the first half here. I think players like Knight and Bin need to get a little bit more aggressive with how they're playing 1v1s, because their big strengths come from being able to generate those leads. And then obviously, I think Shun played great. On's a psychopath. He's always going to play this way. Their mental errors were a problem, and Viper tried to lose some of these games for them, but at the end of the day, once they locked in, they were much better, and I think there still are a lot of positives to take away. When this team is able to get their leads, they are almost impossible to deal with. But that's going to bring us to our second series of the day, and this one to me is a little bit more one-sided in terms of the expectations, but as we saw earlier, you never really know how games are going to go at first stand. It's the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports, taking on the number 1 seed from the LCP in Team Secret Whales, and I'm really excited to see how this ends up breaking down, because I think these regions actually have some interesting history going into each other. It was highlighted well on the desk before this segment. I talked about it a bit in the primer, but G2 has not historically done super well against Vietnamese teams, and obviously Team Secret Whales was kind of shockingly good at Worlds last year. I don't think people really thought that they were going to come out and perform the way that they did. You had multiple players like Histo and Eddie kind of really stepping up in some big moments and really making a lot of waves, internationally speaking, at least in terms of what the expectations were. And I think that there actually are some expectations now that with the Oysters out of the way, with, TSW kind of being elevated into that number 1 team in the LCP, that they might actually have similar levels of success to the Flying Oysters. I was a bit against that. In my primer, I put this as the weakest team at the tournament. Not because I think that they're wholly bad. I think that they have quite a few things going for them, but rather I think this is a very competitive tournament with, basically every team being, competitively good at some level. I think bare minimum, even a team Secret Whales is probably somewhere close to, like the 5th or 6th best team in the tournament in terms of where the power is at. I don't think the bottom 4 are really all that different in terms of what they've shown at the beginning of the year, and that opens up some opportunities and some possibilities for these two teams as they go against each other. G2 obviously kind of rampaging their way through the LEC playoffs, but they did struggle early on in the year, and they did so because their top lane and their bot lane really have not been all that good, not only this year, but quite frankly last year as well. Skewmon has really found his form though, and Caps is in as good a form as you would want him to be in. This guy was phenomenal in the playoffs, absolutely dominated. Skewmon, to me, has been the best player on G2, but Caps really not that far off, and you would expect Caps to elevate his game, as he almost always has done internationally, and that's where I think G2 are going to be looking to get their advantages. You're obviously most interested in this jungle matchup, which we're going to highlight for both sides, Skewmon versus Histo, probably the two most important players for both of these teams in terms of how they're drafts are set up and, just generally how they want to play their early and their mid games. I think both of these junglers are very much tone setters for their individual teams, but Caps going into Dire in the mid lane, that is a massive advantage for G2. This is one of the best mid laners at the tournament, in my opinion, the 3rd best mid laner, only behind Chovy and Knight, who are obviously exceptional going into Dire, who I think is fine as a mid laner, but certainly not exceptional in terms of the mechanical skill that he's shown to output even domestically. This should be a massive advantage for G2, and if you're looking at a spot where you would just expect them to be better, that is the main place that I'd be looking. Top lane as well could actually very sneakily be in G2's favor, depending on how this series ends up going. Pun is an okay player, but he's very passive, very much a team-oriented team fighter, and, somebody who isn't going to dominate the 1v1 in the same kind of way that maybe someone like Hero was for this team last year. Broken Blade should have a mechanical advantage on Pun in terms of being able to generate advantages on the top side. He's not really shown the ability to capitalize on good matchups yet throughout 2026, but you never really know when he's going to be able to break through, and quite frankly, Pun might be an easier matchup than some of the top laners he was facing in the LEC like Kana. So for Broken Blade, hopefully he can have a good series. Skew's going to need to step up and be the better jungler. I project that he will, but I think the solo laners are in favor of G2, and that's probably where they're going to get a big advantage. As for Secret Whales, on the other side, when you're looking at where they need to focus in order to get their leads, obviously it's Histo in the jungle. I know that there are a lot of big Histo fans out there. He was really good at Worlds last year. I think he's been very good domestically. The problem is that he can play a style that relies a lot on being able to facilitate the rest of his team. He is very aggressive in terms of his engages. He loves to play things like Vi and Xin Zhao and Jarvan, these early game aggressors that want to try and go in and, snowball the game out of control. But to do that, you need to make sure your team is in a spot to be able to follow up. He's not really a 1v9 carry type of jungler, and that does concern me at a tournament like this because he kind of needs to be the best player on this team, and while he can be the best player on this team, who is he going to facilitate? That is the big question in this series. The main lane I'm looking at to really step up and be a difference maker if Secret Whales want to upset G2 here today is the bot lane. Eddie is a very mechanically talented player that sometimes just doesn't capitalize on the advantages he's able to generate. Hansama is the weak link of G2. If there is one lane that you are looking at where you can say that TSW might have a better mechanical player, it might be the bot lane, and Eddie is, willing to be aggressive. He is very much willing to push himself forward. He's willing to be kind of the hyper carry of the team. If Histo, Eddie, and BA can link up and really become a pretty dominant trio in terms of moving around the map in the mid game, or if this team just wants to play to bot lane more, I think that's in the favor of Team Secret Whales. But Dire, Pun, they have to survive in terms of the solo lanes. Dire probably has to go neutral, has to go even with Caps in the mid lane in order to make that playstyle as facilitatable as possible, and that's even counting on the fact that Eddie is even better than Hansama, which might not be a given. I had Hansama higher in my rankings, even if it was only by a couple of spots. So, I think Secret Whales are definitely, underdogs. They have their backs up against the wall in a series like this, but I certainly don't think it's impossible for them to come out and win a matchup like this. G2 are certainly not unbeatable. This is a team that has struggled with a lot over the course of this year. They just likely have the two best players on the Rift, but Histo might make that an argument. Is that going to be the case? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And this was a very standard G2 win where they just get this massive lead and kind of snowball the game out of control. Typically, this team plays a little bit slower in the mid game, and we still kind of saw that. They had to wait until they got a 10 or a 12k gold lead. They're a lot more stable in terms of the way that they want to play the map, even when they have gigantic gold leads, because they don't like taking massive risks. It's not really Skewmon style. It's really not Caps' style in terms of how he likes to play the game. They want to be a lot more cool, calm, and collected with the lead that they're able to generate, and it really worked out for them in this case. There weren't really a lot of avenues for Secret Whales to get back into the game. While it might have gone a little bit longer than maybe some other teams at this tournament would with this lead, it was probably a lot more stable than even some of the teams we've already talked about here on day number 1. Really great performance from multiple individual players of G2. There are 3 in particular that I think had fantastic games. Secret Whales, I think, put up a good fight. There were multiple plays that I think they tried to make. I think His Toe had a good game on the Jarvan. I think D-Ray had a really good game on the Aurora. He was doing a lot of damage, even if his laning phase wasn't perfect, but you know, mid lane was the lane to watch for a reason. Caps is player of the game for game number 1. This is international Caps showing up and playing Ahri. You know, I love this draft overall for G2. I think it's one of the more consistent drafts of the tournament up until this point. Again, only 2 series. I feel like that's a superfluous statement, but you understand what I mean. I love Vi Ahri. You guys know I think that is a duo that continues to be really difficult to deal with. I think Ezreal Bard is massive on the bottom side here. Not only can you play safe on the Ezreal when Bard wants to roam, but I think the 2v2 is massively in your favor if you do want to try and get this Ezreal into a good spot, which means that Eddie doesn't really have a lot of tools to be able to play here on the Corki, especially because they banned out his most played champions like Kai'Sa and Yunara, the hyper carries he likes to go towards. And so he's playing this Corki who wants to bridge into the mid game, you know, with a good early laning phase in a matchup where he's not really going to be able to play it out because the Rakan doesn't really facilitate that. Caps and Skewmon took full advantage of the fact that bot lane was almost always going to be pushed. They played super aggro because you could move the Bard up from the bottom side of the map, and they found pick after pick after pick. Caps feeling himself in this game. He gets a Magi's, and I think Vedius said it on the cast. It might be his first Magi's of the year in terms of the buy. I mean, Caps was just unbelievably good in game number 1. If he's going to play like this and play this aggressive on the Ahri, constantly look for a lot of these picks, it's going to be really hard to take down the middle of the map here because, as we know, Skewmon is very good at following up on things that Caps is able to create. We saw some awesome mechanical plays from Skewmon in this game on the Vi, which you don't often say about this duo. I mean, the 2 that you typically highlight for G2 were absolutely the carries here, but do not count out Labrov. Labrov has, you know, really started to step up a lot of Bard play throughout 2026. He was inconsistent on this champion last year, as I talked about pretty extensively on the channel, but it's been his most played across this year up until this point, and he's almost always looked good in big moments on the champion. He looked awesome in this game. Multiple great tempered fates to be able to salvage Caps' over-aggressive positioning and be able to get him out of situations to keep his Magi stacks up. And then obviously just some nice stuns and aggression, you know, roams coming in from him throughout a lot of the mid game. So Labrov, Caps, Skewmon, I think played great. Broken Blade had a terrible teleport into the mid lane, but outside of that was pretty big on the Rumble. And then Hans actually had a really solid game, got caught out a couple of times, as he always does, because he's just not a good mid game player. He doesn't really understand where he's supposed to be, but the team fights were pretty solid. And the moment that this team got a massive lead, he was able to play front to back really easily. So overall, nice win for G2. Really good way to start the series. And then for Secret Whales on the other side, you obviously have some pluses and some minuses. This draft is fine. I really don't love it. I think you're in a spot, especially with Corki Rakan. I hate kind of rounding it out with that. I think I really like it up until that point. I think Aurora's typically pretty difficult to execute on. I don't love playing Jarvan when Vi is available on the other side because I think Vi is just kind of better Jarvan in terms of what she can do. Certainly gives you a bit more options, but things like Ornn is the answer. You know, Jarvan, Aurora in isolation, I think can be a pretty good playmaking duo. I just worry a bit about where this comp is supposed to even go throughout a lot of the mid game because you're not going to have pressure in the bot lane or really the mid lane here with Ahri. So I don't really understand exactly what the identity is, and I think they struggled to find it out as well. While His Toe and D-Ray were in okay spots throughout a lot of this game, they weren't necessarily consistently getting resources. D-Ray was super far behind until he was able to pull back some picks in some big team fights in the mid game. And then His Toe, I think, had some really nice engages on the Jarvan, had some really, really great early skirmishes, but had absolutely nobody to follow up on a lot of those situations, which is the biggest problem with Secret Whales. People keep talking to me about how His Toe is going to be able to carry this team. I just don't really know what he's supposed to do in games like this. He's finding good angles, and he has nobody to be able to back him up because this team drafted very little damage. Eddie and BA were really far behind on the bottom side. Pun, I don't think really was able to get anything done on the Ornn. This was basically to just hope and pray that Rumble was not going to get fed, and yet Rumble was still finding flanks in the later part of the game, if only just because he was walking up from side lanes and there were no wards. But at the end of the day, a flank is a flank. I'm not going to judge too much. Like, this is just one of those games where Secret Whales lost pressure early. They gave a ton of gold to the 2 best players on G2, and they just really didn't have the firepower to be able to get this back. This was a pretty big stomp, and you have to hope that they're going to be able to turn it around in game number 2, because we already thought this was going to be the less competitive series of the day. In game number 1, it's already kind of looking like that is going to be the case. Hopefully, TSW can fight back and tie this series up at 1 apiece. And then for G2 on the other side, of course, you're really hopeful that they can just kind of dominate this again, get to a 2-0 lead, and hopefully sweep this series. You want them to have as much momentum as possible going into a potential matchup with Bilibili Gaming if they're able to win this series, but you do want to keep your foot on the gas. This was a very good draft from this team, and you're not going to get a draft like this, obviously, again, going into game number 2. You need to make sure you can do it on something a bit less consistent. So, who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports, they are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they're going to do so in, the most straightforward, clean, no problem game that you could possibly imagine. Now, obviously, this was incredibly fun. This was probably the most fun game of the day up until this point, just back and forth action. Both teams playing, I think, pretty well, all things considered. I don't think either team was making massive mistakes. I think both were doing what they needed to do. It really looked like Team Secret Whales was going to come out on top in this one. They had a pretty big lead towards basically the entire ending of this game, but they make one massive mistake. G2 does a great job of rushing a Baron that basically forces Team Secret Whales to make a decision. His toe dives in on this super fed Nefiri, and Dire is on the flank, on the Akali, and it feels like they could potentially try and sandwich this team, but G2 was able to get onto the Nefiri, able to taunt up that champion, burst her down, and the moment that 10 kill jungler is off the board, all of a sudden that fight is a ton easier. Hansama can start stepping forward, and the game is won for G2. This was not clean. This was not, an efficient game by any stretch of the imagination, but you know what? It was pretty fun. And honestly, again, I kind of mean this. I think both teams played pretty well in this game. I don't think this was necessarily G2 completely throwing the game away by losing in the late game, although I do think that it's kind of preposterous that this was close at all, considering how the early game went for this team. But I think Secret Whales definitely needed to be a bit more calm, cool, and collected down the stretch, and they just didn't really have the juice in that regard. We'll go ahead and talk about it here. Player of the game for me is going to Hansama in the bot lane. This is the best game he's played in 2026. I feel pretty confident in saying that. This guy's really struggled to play really consistent front-to-back pieces, kind of similar to what we talked about with Viper. Sometimes when he gets these champions that have a lot of agency, he can feel a little bit pressured to go out there and be a playmaker for the team, and I think for the most part, he's actually just in a better spot, playing, a little bit more stable, a little bit more regular, that front-to-back style, and hoping and praying that he has enough damage to be able to break through. He was excellent in this game. Do not mind the 2 deaths. Neither of them were obviously his fault. It's just, look at the comp on the other side. Olaf, Nefiri, Akali, even the Nautilus, so much backline access coming in from Team Secret Whales, and yet somehow, someway, Hansama was topping the damage charts in every single fight, even without something like a Seraphine on the other side to be able to dominate lane on. The Braum is Omega in this draft, and we'll talk about that in a second as well, but being able to survive Olaf and Nefiri and Akali and still being the most useful champion throughout basically all of this game, this was awesome from Hansama. I am a big Hansama doubter, but I can't deny this game. I mean, this was really, really good. I'm definitely going to give him his flowers when he earns it. I don't think he's been very good throughout this year, but I think this was maybe his best game of the entire year up until this point, and it does help kind of further this narrative. Hans was not really a good international player for G2 for a very long time, but Worlds last year, I think, was really the first time where that felt like it shifted. It's cool to see him bring that form back to first stand here, where he is playing better than he was domestically. Skewmond is the other player you really want to shout out here, having a really great game on the Aatrox. There were a lot of times where he was basically trying to 1v3 in a team fight and just hoping and praying he had enough damage to be able to break through. I'm not going to blame him at all for this game. There were a couple of moments where I think he needed to be a bit more synced up with the rest of his team, but really that's a minor nitpick. I think Hansama was in a spot where you just had to hope that the rest of the team could peel him off and that the Aatrox could be that secondary damage dealer in case that doesn't happen, and Skew, I think, filled that role very well. His macro calls this game were fantastic, and he was always in the right spot, so Skew continuing to step up. I think everybody else on the team was fine. Broken Blade gets solo killed level 1 for First Blood, which is a nightmare for Kled. The game should be entirely over there. I still think this Kled champion is entirely boosted, and maybe that's just me, but he's able to actually be kind of useful at the end of this game. He's not really able to do any damage, but he buys a lot of time for the rest of the team with that gigantic Kled health bar, and he gets a lot of really key mounts towards the end of this game to be able to survive some ganks onto the bottom side. So, Broken Blade, not with the worst game in the world. Caps was fine on the Galio, not ever supposed to be a carry in this comp, but had a couple of nice ultimates, even if he was very rarely actually a huge difference maker in teamfights. He had one really big taunt in a teamfight that did change it by catching, I believe it was his toe out, and really kind of, ending the game, quite frankly, at the end there. And then LeBron had a couple of moments where he was too far forward, and you're going to criticize him for that, but Braum is so good in this draft that it almost doesn't even matter. G2 with a nice win, even though they tried their best to throw it. I like their draft better than I like Team Secret Whales. I think they have more options, especially going into the mid game, so long as they don't throw away their lead, which they tried to do, but luckily they were able to pull it back. As for Secret Whales on the other side, first and foremost, I just want to point this out. I tweeted this out during the game. Does Vedius have something against Team Wales? Again, he just keeps calling them Team Secret or TS. He is completely out on calling them Team Secret Whales. These teams merged back, or I guess the beginning of last year, the beginning of 2025, both Team Secret and Team Wales, but apparently he's got some 2024 Artemis trauma, as I think we all do in some way, shape, or form, whether for good or for bad, and he just refused to say the Wales part through game 1 and game 2. I'll keep an eye out for how that that goes in a potential game 3 and maybe even more, obviously, as we talk about this a bit more. But jokes aside, like, they tried their best to win this game. Their comp is really fun, and I think it really fits the identity of who this team is. HizToe wants to be diving into the backline, and this team wants to follow up with him. I think there were multiple picks in this draft that were massive. I really like the idea of Misfortune Nautilus as the answer to Ashe, especially because you assume that they're going to go Seraphine as the support. But once you see Misfortune Nautilus, there's not a single bot lane in the entire universe that gets beaten harder by Braum than Misfortune Nautilus. Both of them get absolutely destroyed by that champion on the other side of the matchup. And even Akali, like, this is a bad Akali game, even though it's DRA's signature champion. This is kind of a hard Nefiri game if you have good peel coming in on the other side. They were kind of outcomped in a lot of different ways in this draft, in my opinion, and yet they still were able to win a lot of these fights through sheer determination, through sheer dive, quite frankly. Unfortunately, DRA just didn't do enough damage in this game. He gets his signature champion in Akali, and to me, he's done of the game. I think he needed to be bigger in this one. It's hard to play Akali. I understand this is not the best Akali game. In fact, it's not even a good Akali game. The Galio matchup is really tough in the laning phase because he can just taunt you out of Shroud and you can't really do any damage to him, and you're basically going to get taunted every single team fight. Either that or you're getting exhausted by the Braum, or, you know, Aatrox is zoning you off. You're getting slowed by the Ashe. Like, there are a ton of things going against you in this game if you are the Akali, but them basically not having that extra damage piece down the stretch when Pun was trying his best to break through the front line. You have Misfortune doing a great job kiting. Eddie had a great game on this MF, and then HizToe obviously was massive. If you had that extra piece in the mid lane that actually had some gold, I think the game actually changes quite a bit. So to me, DRA is probably the least effective, although again, I don't think anybody was particularly bad for Team Secret Whales. I think this more just came down to the fact that DRA was the least effective at trying to do his job. I think Pun had a consideration for that, especially because he got such a big early lead. He was up like 40 CS and obviously a solo kill into that matchup into Kled, which really should not happen in that 1v1, obviously, on the top side, but never really got the chance to really break through and kill the Ashe on the backline in these massive fights. And that's kind of the big difference maker here for G2, is that Hansama got to live a little longer than maybe you would want. HizToe had a great game, but at the end of the day, he is the one who gets caught to basically end the game at the Baron. He dives in trying to capitalize on a flank from DRA and just goes in way too early, gets bursted down, and that's all the gold gone for Secret Whales, and that ends the game on the spot. Again, I think Eddie played well and HizToe played well. I think BA had a couple of nice hooks in this game, even if he was also aiming for some of the more obvious targets. There are just too many frontliners on G2. There's not really a lot of targets to hit. It's really just the Ashe that you can land the hook on. Maybe the Aatrox, but even then, it's not really a good target. It's a hard Nautilus game to end up playing. But Secret Whales tried their best. They had a chance to win this game, and they just couldn't win the fight that mattered the most. G2 kind of called their bluff on that Baron rush, and it ended up really working out for them. And now they're up 2-0 in this series. One more game for Secret Whales to potentially stay alive. They do not want to get clean swept in this first round. They want to probably take at least one, especially with how that game 2 went. They don't want that to be the image of how close they could get. They want to be able to showcase that they can beat G2, but G2 want to get out of this series. They have been tested through at least the second game here. Game 1 wasn't particularly difficult for them, but they don't want any more problems. They want to move on to that upper bracket final here in this group and play Bilibili Gaming. They want to get to that next round. Are they going to be able to close it out in a clean sweep, or will Secret Whales win one game and keep themselves alive at the very least for one more? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to clean sweep this series 3-0, and they will be moving on to take on Bilibili Gaming in the first qualification series of their group in just a couple of days. Very exciting, of course, for G2 to be able to pick up the victory here and to do it in pretty good fashion. You know, game 2, game 3, both of them were, you know, Secret Whales wins in the early game, and then obviously G2 ended up fighting their way back after some gold deficits, but it really goes to show that the identity of all these teams domestically very much is going to carry over. We talked about that earlier on today. Both Bilibili and BNK FearX in the first series were exactly what they were domestically in terms of stylistic, you know, tendencies, where, you know, you got a BLG team that was really good early and bad late, and a BFX team that has good mechanics but can sometimes struggle in multiple matchups, but is a really good team fighting team, and we saw how that played out. Here for G2, I think we saw exactly the same. This is a team fight oriented team, a team that prefers the game to be a bit slower paced, and a team that's almost always going to be more efficient towards the end of the game than they are towards the beginning. It's just the way they naturally like to play. It's Scumon's style in particular, and he has been such a leader on the team this year that they've naturally gravitated towards the style that is most comfortable for what has been their most important piece. And boy, is it working out for G2 at the very least for now. Do you want to see their early games get a bit better? Yes, but I don't think it's entirely Scumon's fault that his laners are doing poor in the 1v1s in lane. They obviously need to start stepping up individually, but it doesn't really matter when you're able to, like, I guess efficiently be able to win team fights in the later part of the game, even if you're in worse spots. For Secret Secret Whales, you got to be at least a little excited for them. I don't think it's the same story as it was for Game 2. Game 2, I honestly think both teams just played really well. Game 3 was a bit more of a fiesta, a bit more crazy in terms of how things broke down. It definitely felt like they were feeling some of the effects of international play, some of the tilting, some of the, some of the nerves, right? I think that is fair to say that it was more on their face in Game 3 than it was in Game 2. But I still think them going toe-to-toe against G2 is a good sign that this team is at least okay. I mean, you're obviously expecting them to be the worst team in this group, to not pick up a win. It's not going to get easier from here. You would argue that their next opponent is even more difficult in FearX, that we'll obviously talk about at the end of this video. But at the very least, they put up a good fight here today, even if they weren't able to take a game. So let's talk about it. Player of the game and a player of this series for me as a whole is going to Skewmond in the jungle. He really is the best player on G2. He is able to really facilitate everything that's going on the map. If you don't want to give him player of the game and you want to give him to Broken Blade instead, you want to give, BB that player of the game on the top side despite getting solo killed at level 3 on the Shen, that's perfectly fine by me. I really don't have a massive problem with that. I think Skewmond had a slightly bigger impact on the game as a whole, although I think it was very, very close. And those Shen ultimates were massive towards winning some skirmishes towards the middle of this game, but I really wanted to give Skewmond a player of the game here, mostly because he was definitely getting player of the series, and it just feels weird to give player of the series to somebody who wasn't player of the game once. He was the most consistent piece, I would say, throughout all 3 of their victories. He was really excellent on the Vi in Game 1. The Aatrox tried its best to, continue to keep the Ashe facilitated in Game 2 and be that secondary damage dealer, and he was good in that role. And then I think the Trundle was massive in Game number 3 towards shutting down the Mundo, really making that champion feel decently irrelevant in a lot of these team fights, and then, of course, having multiple phenomenal pillars throughout a lot of this game. So really nothing but good things to say about Skewmond. He's continued the trend of being, in my opinion, the best European jungler right now. I did not have that take at the beginning of the year, but I've very much changed my tune. I'm happy to have been wrong about, Skewmond right now, because he is very much, I think, asserted himself as arguably the top player in Europe in terms of the performances he's been putting on so far in 2026, but certainly, in my opinion, the best jungler in the region. Caps had a really good series. I think Dire had some really fun moments in the 1v1 here in lane on the Sylas. The Azir is something that obviously has gotten nerfed quite a bit, and I didn't know how much we were going to see it at this tournament. I figured teams like Gen G were going to be pretty comfortable picking it up, but I didn't know how many early teams before they play were going to be comfortable picking it up. Caps also kind of known for his Azir play, not only in lane, but out of lane as well. And of course, can do a lot of interesting things. He doesn't fall susceptible to LEC Azir syndrome nearly as much as his compatriots in his own region do, but he definitely still had a good game here. Had a couple of nice shoves overall, but for the most part was, again, the kind of Azir that I think you want to see in a game like this, which is just a backline damage dealer to go alongside the Yunara when you already have such consistent frontline alongside a Lulu. So credit to Caps. I think Lulu was great. Labrov piloted the champion well. The champion's super OP. We'll talk about that. I think from a draft perspective, G2 once again for 3 games in a row kind of walked out with a better draft, in my opinion. We'll talk about the Aphelios Thresh. I really hate that as the answer to this bot lane on the other side. I really don't like the Mundo first pick either, although I think it's playable. I just think with Trundle up, it's obviously going to be a lot more difficult, and Mundo is a very counterable pick. You're basically playing this infinite scaler or this, team fight threat into a team that is better than you in team fights, which is never really a good feeling. Aphelios Thresh, I think, has a really hard time playing into Lulu in general. Aphelios can't auto-attack the Shen really at all in this game, and I've always considered Thresh to have a bad matchup into the Lulu. We'll talk about that more for BA on the other side, but I think Labrov did well to pilot the comp and obviously to ult the right targets, to polymorph at the right times. Like, you don't have to have masterful execution to be really good on Lulu. That champion is just naturally very good. But Broken Blade, again, if you wanted to give him player of the game, be my guest. I mean, this guy falls down early and then, arrives back to get a double kill right around, I think, like the 7 or 8 minute mark, somewhere around that point in the game. And from then on, the Shen was massive. Those shields coming through on the ultimate, very, very big. I expected to see Shen at this tournament, but I expected to see it in the jungle. I think it's very strong right now in terms of, the jungle priority. I think there are a lot of champions that are getting picked regularly that aren't nearly as good as Shen. I think Mundo and Trundle might even be a part of that group, where I might rather have Shen right now. And I think we kind of saw that on the top side because this champion just does so much, even when they don't have a ridiculous amount of resources. But Broken Blade's more than happy to be able to take this as a counter pick, even if the counter pick didn't necessarily work. It still definitely paid off in the end. Hans was fine as well. Again, game 2, definitely a lot more flashy. He didn't make mistakes here in game 3. Overall, a fine series for Hans. I think game 2 is definitely the standout, but not really a bad game 3 by any stretch. G2 just did well here today. They probably could have played cleaner in the early game. They certainly could have played cleaner in the early game, but at the end of the day, all that really matters is walking out of here with the victory, and that's exactly what they did without dropping a single game. And then for Secret Whales on the other side, You're obviously bummed you didn't pick up a win here. You probably really wanted to take at least one of these games, considering the leads you had in both Game 2 and Game 3, especially here in Game 3, where it really felt like this game was kind of getting out of control pretty quickly with the amount of gold that was on the Sylas, and you having an Aphelios and a Jax and a Mundo. Like, having a gold lead on this comp and then losing the game definitely feels quite bad. Not that you're not playing into Shen, Azir, Yunara on the other side or anything like that. Definitely a much slower pace game in terms of the drafts. But you could see it. Team Secret Whales really, really wanted to get this game. You could see it on their faces the moment they started throwing this away, like, and started to lose gold and started to get a little bit more outplayed in terms of the macro. You could see that they started to get pretty tilted on the map, and that's definitely frustrating. I think Pun in particular is probably the biggest culprit of that. He's going to get done of the game for me. He obviously gets that massive solo kill on the top side early on in the game on Shen. It looks like he's going to completely eliminate Broken Blade from the laning phase once again for basically a third game in a row, certainly in a second game in a row after the Olaf into Kled matchup in game number 2, but Broken Blade's able to fight his way back, able to even up the gold at least relatively, and Pun really doesn't have the impact that he wants in the later part of the game. He makes a couple of really head-scratching engages on the Jax that really do come back to bite him and give free gold over to G2. Some of that is useful, some of that just ended up being, you know, after the game was over, quite frankly, but he just didn't really have an impact, and he threw away a lot of his big early lead, which is frustrating. Hopefully he can mentally recover, because it did seem like he was pretty tilted, especially after dying in a 1v1 on the top side a little later on in the game. You could see the visual reaction of him, like, you know, flying back in surprise, and so you obviously hope that he's okay and, you know, feeling good going into the next series, because they kind of need him to be at least okay. He was just very aggressive in this series, some of it paying off, and unfortunately in this game, not a lot of it paying off, especially towards the back end. Dire also ends up with 6 deaths. I understand that he had all these kills on Sylas, but boy, was this guy playing as greedy as possible, despite being in a position where if he just played regular, they probably win this game. Like, if you wanted to give dud of the game to Dire again after game number 2 as well, I think that's also relatively fair, even though he had all of the kills on the team, because if he just played normal, if he just played front to back and, like, didn't run it down and die first in every team fight, I think they likely win the game. It's just he was not stable enough. He didn't play particularly safe. His toe was completely irrelevant in this game on the Dr. Mundo. You know, that's a champion that I think is very overrated right now in terms of professional play. There are a lot of ways to be able to take it out of the game. Picking it blind with the Trundle still on the table is very bold, especially into a team like G2 that would love to slam Trundle for basically any reason in the world, and his toe was nothing. Like, he was not surviving. He couldn't frontline in any of these team fights because of not only Trundle ult, but because he was super far behind in terms of resources. He barely hit second item by the time this game ended. Like, he was really, really far behind in terms of tempo. This was easily his weakest game of the entire series, mostly because he was finally on something that wasn't actually a facilitator for the rest of the team. In the first couple of games, he had agency. He had to be a lot more passive in this one, and I think that's just a bad role for his toe overall. I do want to give some credit to the bot lane. I think they were the best part of the team here. Eddie could not do anything because he was auto-attacking a Shen who blocked every single auto-attack he had throughout the back end of the game, but BA, I think, actually was the best player on the team in this game. Tried his best on the Thresh to make some pretty flashy plays, ended up getting away with quite a few really interesting ones, and was a big reason, in my opinion, why they ended up getting a gold lead in this particular game. Even more impressive when you consider that, I don't know about everybody, I consider, like, Lulu a really bad matchup for Thresh in the laning phase. I think it's very difficult for him to find any sort of stability, and obviously the polymorph can make it more difficult to try and save anybody in the later part of the game with the Lantern, and so there's just a lot of things that can go wrong in the Thresh matchup, and BA still managed to find a way, I think, to be a good playmaker in the game for the team. He just had nobody to play make for, because Dire was killing himself. Pun was just not really scaling into the late game. Eddie can't auto-attack anybody, and his toe was basically made of paper. So pretty difficult matchup for Team Secret Whales, and now they move down to the lower bracket where it gets even harder, and they have to face FearX from the LCK. That's obviously not a matchup they're going to be favorited in, but they look competitive at this tournament. You didn't really expect them to win a series. Hopefully they can win a game at first stand, but for now, unfortunately, that last ranked spot in my power rankings might actually be a little bit accurate for this team. And then for G2 on the other side, expected win here. I mean, I kind of expected them to drop a game just because they're G2 and it's what they do, not because they're worse, but because they're inconsistent. This team loves losing random games at the beginning of series and then going on runs. It's just how they've always been. They end up doing the clean sweep, though, not entirely up to them. They get to the late game in all three and end up being able to close out the second and third games. They're obviously going to need to be better than they were today to beat Bilibili Gaming. You can't really have these flaws in the early game against probably the best early game team in the entire world right now. You know, obviously they have a lot of flaws outside of that, but in terms of raw laning and mechanics, BLG is probably better than anybody else in terms of generating leads, and G2 might be very susceptible to that. I don't love this matchup for them, but at the very least, they're one series away from potentially qualifying into the semifinals, which ultimately should be the goal for this team at this tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2026 First Stand Day Number 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after the first 2 best of 5s that we got. We know Bilibili Gaming and G2 will be moving on to a qualification match. Remember, the winner of that will come out of this group as the first seed. That means they will face the second seed coming out of the other group and move on to the semifinals, whereas the loser will go down into that second qualification match on the lower bracket to face the winner of BNK FearX and Team Secret Whales. We can quickly preview those series. I already previewed the other group matchups. I'll touch upon what I said in those in my primer video in this one, just so I can remind you guys for day number 2, but I'll touch quickly upon the matchups I'm expecting, or what I'm expecting out of the matchups here in that first group. Starting with BLG and G2. BLG should be the better of these two teams. Again, I think stylistically this is a nightmare matchup for G2 unless they can weather the storm in the early game, and in which case I think this actually could be okay. This is kind of a feast or famine matchup for BLG, as most of their matchups tend to be, because if they just snowball games out of control, G2 is one of those teams that will give you free resources in the early and in the mid game, because their top lane is going to die, their bot lane is going to die, hell, their mid laner is going to die every so often in the laning phase. It's just the way that G2 plays. They're going to give you gold, and if you can snowball games out of control against them, that can be a bit of a problem. But again, if G2 can weather that storm, get to the late game, they might be a better team fighting team than BLG. They might be better at late game execution. I've called G2 kind of budget JD gaming all year long. I really do think they're very similar teams. I don't even think they're all that different in terms of skill level, but them and JDG I think are decently similar in terms of a stylistic matchup, and we saw what JDG could do even when BLG got some early leads by weathering the storm. So hopefully, you know, G2 can have some fight in them. I think BLG should be pretty heavily favored here because of that early game matchup, but again, G2 has an opportunity to be able to take some games here if BLG aren't on their A game. Then for BFX versus Secret Whales, I mean, if G2 versus Secret Whales was a 3-0, you can definitely imagine that the Foxes versus Secret Whales will be a 3-0. FearX is a better team, in my opinion, than G2. I think they have a lot to prove coming out of that series against BLG, and I think they're going to prove it. I think Diablo into Eddie is a nightmare matchup for Secret Whales because they're not really going to be able to get their bot lane going, and then you just have to hope and pray that your solo laners can, you know, even survive. Like Vikla and Clear had some rough games today against BLG. It's not like D-Ray and Pun were like perfect on the other side of those matchups. Those still feel like very negative circumstances. Histo versus Raptor is really fun in terms of a stylistic matchup, but I would favor Raptor in that particular matchup as well. BFX should be significantly better. This should be a 3-0, and it shouldn't be particularly close. Let me know if you agree with those, and then as a reminder, I picked Gen.G and Lion on the other side of this. Gen.G should blow out JDG. I think this is a terrible matchup for JD Gaming. I think they match up as poorly as possible into a team like Gen.G. And then Lion versus Loud, I think, is probably the closest of the pool 2 matchups. Like G2 Secret Whales, we always kind of knew G2 was going to be heavily favored. I think Loud could win a couple of games, maybe even an entire series against Lion if things go poorly. I think the top lane matchup is certainly worth watching. I think that, you know, obviously you're hoping and praying the bot lane can do well. Bull into Berserker is going to be a fun LCK rematch, you know, from a couple of years ago, or I guess last year technically. And, you know, obviously 2 guys who have been in similar systems at different times throughout their careers. But the jungle matchup in particular really gives me a lot of faith that Lion should be able to pick this up. Inspired is significantly better than Youngjae and should be a lot better at this tournament. Same thing for Saint going into Envy. You would imagine the middle of the map is very Lion favored, and that's why I favored them. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're covering every single day of First Stand exactly like this, going up as quickly as possible on the channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of all the games that we're getting, as well as the 4 major regions, or 4 of the major regions coming out of this tournament, being the LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all